There we go. All right. Well, I'm glad I didn't record that story. Um, Nobody needs to hear that story. So welcome everybody to Peter White Public Library. My name is Marty Atkinson. I'm the adult programming coordinator here at Peter White. And it's always my pleasure to welcome Ellen to Artists and Their Art to do her presentations. I always learn so much. I think I know something about the artist, and then it's always something really eye-opening and new. So I really appreciate these programs. So I just want to highlight a couple things upcoming for this month and next month. So tomorrow night we conclude we've been doing a series of programs on C.S. Lewis. It was a C.S. Lewis holidays this year at Peter White Public Library. So we had a really wonderful C.S. Lewis scholar, Andrew Lazo from Florida, who joined us virtually and did a really, really fascinating presentation about C.S. Lewis's life and work. That is still available if you are interested in it. You can go to our recorded programs and watch that. I really recommend it. He was really fantastic. But tomorrow night, we're going to conclude with a movie starting at 6:30 in the community room. And that is going to be the movie adaptation of C.S. Lewis's The Chronicles of Narnia, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And that's going to be starting at 6:30 p.m. in the community room. Everybody's welcome. It's no charge to anybody. There's free popcorn. Thanks to the Friends of Peter White Public Library for that. And let's see. And then the next 2 weeks is going to be pretty quiet at the library. Everybody has their own stuff to do during Christmas and New Year's. So, but come January, we have some really wonderful programs upcoming. We have a Daryl Syria project. The Daryl Syria project is going to be doing a concert on January 21st. We have another concert that's called Words and Music for Hope. And that's going to be a group of local poets and poets who are going to be doing songs that are all about joy and hope. And I think that's going to be a really wonderful, it's going to be the day following Martin Luther King Day. Some of the musicians that we have scheduled are Brian Wall and Dylan Trost, Troy Graham, Cloverland, that includes Carrie Yost and Sarah Middlefeld. So it's going to be a really, really wonderful, wonderful concert and event, Words and Music for Hope. And then we have some great movies coming up as well. We have a documentary about Martin Luther King called In Remembrance of Martin, which is a documentary where they interviewed a bunch of Dr. King's family and friends and colleagues. And then we have a really wonderful global cinema, a French film called The Grocer's Son. And then for the end of the month, our blockbusting cinema, we're going to be showing the movie, Steven Spielberg's movie, The Post, which is stars Meryl Streep and Tom Hanks. And that one is about a presidential scandal that it's a true story about a presidential scandal that Ben Bradley from the Washington Post, played by Tom Hanks, and Meryl Streep, who plays Katharine Graham, the publisher of the Washington Post. It's that story. So I really welcome you to come to all of those events. There's a bunch of other things happening as well. You can all find those at Peter White Public Library, pwpl.info. That's where you can find our events page. But now that I've got that preliminary stuff out of the way, I'm going to turn things over to Ellen. I think most people know who Ellen is. She's a professor emerita from Merrimack College. Wonderful, wonderful woman I'm privileged to call my friend. I'm so excited to hear part 2 of her presentation on Michelangelo. So I'm going to mute myself now, and I'm going to turn things over to Ellen.
Well, thank you, Marty, very, very much. And I'm pleased to know that you call me your friend. I feel the same way about you. So good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining me and Michelangelo. And here's, if you were with me 3 months ago. You remember this elderly portrait of Michelangelo by a friend of his, just to review what he looked like at the end of his very long, and as you will come to see, extraordinarily complicated career. Last time things, as in his works, preceded one another pretty simply. It is not that way, or was not that way after 1500, as you'll see. In any event, you may recall this figure of David that Donatello created for the buttresses somewhere, the buttresses up top of the Florence Cathedral, which had been recently domed by Filippo Brunelleschi and in need of some important decorations. Well, it was never placed there because although this figure is a little over 6 feet tall, it was deemed absolutely too small. And this is a project, that is the decoration of the upper reaches of the Duomo, that continued clearly to be talked about by those in power. This is the facade of the Duomo, the Cathedral of Florence. And sometime mid-century, if you'll skip down to the sentence in parentheses, there was a very large block of marble that was given to 2 sculptors in succession, Duccio and Rossellino, and clearly they couldn't do anything with it. So in 1501, it was given to Michelangelo. We don't know what the flaws were, but they had to have been considerable so that these other 2 sculptors could not handle the work at all. In sum, what you have here, as you can read, is a 17-foot high figure of David. You might ask, maybe some of you already know the answer, but why David of all biblical figures? Because, of course, he slew Goliath. And Florence, during a very good part of its history, and at this time, where we are in the history of this very fine city-state, she was one of the only republics on a peninsula, on the Italic Peninsula, along with Siena and a couple of others. And so feeling herself, as did the other republics, in a minority, choosing David as her symbol of potential victory over all comers, as large as it could possibly get in the form of Goliath, seems only logical. As you can read here, the figure was never placed on top of the Duomo. The reason given is that it was far too beautiful, far too handsome to be seen from so far below, as in approximately 60 feet below. And in 1873, it was placed where we see it now, in the Accademia, in a niche, quite handsome. You'll see some other views of it there, but not as, of course, it was meant to be seen. For a time, it stood in front of what is known as the Palazzo Vecchio, the Palazzo della Signoria, which means the palace of the ruling body of the Republic of Florence, the Signoria. And if you've been to Florence, you know that a statue of David stands there in front of the doorway, which is very difficult to see, but it's there, of course, in the lower level, and there's a copy of the David standing there as if, guarding the doorway. And while it was there for quite a number of years, as you can see, its private parts were covered with a fig leaf. And you might notice, I think you can see this in this slide, that its right arm was broken in several parts. And all of this was repaired, the fig leaf was removed, and so forth when it was moved into the Accademia. Let's go to the next slide. Well, no, let's stay here for just a moment. Now, you might say to yourselves, the proportions of this figure are just wrong. The legs are too long. The torso is too broad and rather short. And the hands, which is always a comment I hear, are over large. And the head is also over large and emphasized, the face emphasized by that rich shock of hair. Well, as you might remember from the last time I spoke to you about Michelangelo's sculptures, as he began working with figures to be placed in certain situations, it was the placement that determined the proportions, the details or lack thereof, of each and every one of those figures. And you can say that he learned that from Donatello, but took it even further. So here's, I think, a very fine photograph. Somebody took it, sitting on the floor of the Accademia, aiming up at the David, and you get a much better idea of what Michelangelo intended. And the exquisite finish of this figure will hardly ever find repetition in Michelangelo's subsequent work, as we'll see. But this is a figure you don't want to take on, do you? Even if you're Goliath. And then you see the rear of the figure also finely finished, although there was no way it would have been seen. And note the sling that falls over the back and around to the right hand of the figure. Now, one of my, if I may so say, illustrious art historical friends, John Pauletti, known for many, many, many publications on Renaissance sculpture, was in the process of writing a piece on this hand and what it possesses. Tradition has it that this right hand holds the rock that slew Goliath. But there's no indication that there's a rock there at all, according to John. And if you look closely, it just isn't there. It's the end of the sash. So, a puzzle, perhaps needing to be solved, but a little bit of truth brought to the sculpture that otherwise would be lying dormant. Thank you, John Pauletti. Now, at the same time, Michelangelo is working on the David. He is carving what has come to be known as the Bruges Madonna and Child. You notice the dates are absolutely the same, 1501 to 1504. We don't know who initially commissioned the work, if someone did, or it might have been a work that Michelangelo just thought he'd like to take up. But as you can see here from this caption, it was purchased by cloth merchants for a good deal of money. 100 ducats is a few $1,000s in our currency, and was set up in this niche, as you can see, in the Church of Our Lady in Bruges. It's a very different Madonna and Child from the Pietà, although there are similarities. But let's go here. Maybe with these details, you can see what's going on a little bit more clearly. The Madonna does not look at her child. And although she holds his hand, his, let's see, right hand and her left hand, it's not a grasp that is going to keep him with her. And he's about to step down from her lap. Symbolic of, and this is what we think, symbolic of the world in which he is about to step and in which he will serve and die. Now, there are similarities, however, between this Madonna and Child and the Pietà. And then we'll go back to some of the differences. Oh, sorry. And that is the oval shape of her face and the expression that's very hard to read, that's kind, but well, hard to read, I think. What is different also, getting back to the narrative, is the drapery. The drapery here is fairly simple, all things considered, compared to the Pietà, and the composition is much more compact. And this is what we're going to see in Michelangelo's work, no matter what the subject is. An increase in compactness and in the understanding of the figures having emerged from a block of marble. And here's probably even a better photograph of the two of them. Now, this work was stolen during World War II, and it was smuggled into Germany in a Red Cross truck in 1944. And then it was discovered about a year later in a salt mine. And I thought you'd be interested in seeing this photograph of the sculpture, clearly undamaged, which is extraordinary, being rescued from that salt mine. As you probably know, the Nazis were art addicts, or Hitler was, and thank goodness we got this sculpture back in one piece, so to speak. Now, this slide tells you about everything you need to know about the upcoming figures. Two tandi, which means round works, and excuse me, and once again, he's working on these at the same time. He's working on the David and on the Bruges Madonna, but these have been commissioned from him. To read this for you, if I need to, his biographer, Giorgio Vasari, he says, while Michelangelo is working on the David, he also blocked out but did not finish two tandi, one for Taddeo today in his house, and for Bartolomeo Pitti, he began another, which works were considered outstanding and marvelous, certainly very unusual at the time. So the Pitti Tondo is unfinished, as most all of Michelangelo's subsequent works, as you will see, will be, for lack of time and lack of interest. But here is the Madonna seated on a block with her child resting on her lap. It's a composition, not unlike the Bruges Madonna. The figures are slightly differently related to one another, but it's a very compact composition. And the little St. John, barely worked out in the background, is looking on. Now, paintings, which I didn't bring any in for you, but paintings of the Madonna and Child at this period, excuse me, also often include St. John. Of course, if you can remember the opening verses of the book of John, it tells us that he came before to lead the way and to introduce the Savior to the world. I paraphrase. Now, the Taddeo Tande is perhaps a little more interesting in that, let me see. Here, the Madonna's head does not conform in terms of design, in terms of flow with the roundness of the frame, although here it does. So Michelangelo's working on this compositional problem of composing within a round format. And here the work is even less finished than the Pittitondo, but looky here. In the early 16th century, Leonardo came back from where he had been working in Milan, and he brought this cartoon that is a working drawing for a painting that he never completed. But he brought this cartoon, and it was exhibited in Florence, and people just went crazy over it. And clearly, Michelangelo was one of those who thought it was worth more than just admiring. Because look at the child, which is, as one says, swimming across the lap of the Madonna. That's the Madonna and Saint Anne. And he's gesturing, blessing the Saint John. Now, this is what we see here, a swimming child, the Christ child, across his mother's lap. And this is a direct quote from Leonardo. And I thought you'd like this image because it shows you very clearly some of the exquisite chisel work that Michelangelo was in a habit of using to block out, as one says, his figures. And you'll see a lot of this work in other examples going forward here this evening. And what we have here, and this term is somewhere else in a slide coming up, is what is known as non finito, unfinished. And it becomes one of those characteristics of Michelangelo's work that is not heralded as something, that should be criticized. But actually, these passages of non finito help us understand how he created these works, literally from the heart of the marble to the surface. Now, as he is finishing the Bruges Madonna and the David and working on those two Tandi, he is asked by the authorities of the cathedral, the Duomo of Florence, to create 12 apostles for 12 niches in the cathedral. And this St. Matthew is the only one that he even started, because his life becomes more and more complicated. As in 1505, he moves to Rome because Pope Julius II, whom you see mentioned here, who reigned from 1503 to 1513, called Michelangelo to Rome, more like he ordered him, and the two did not get along. So here's, excuse me, the non finito spelled out if you'd like to know how how that spells. Now, for most of the rest of my time with you, we'll be going to and from this tomb of Julius II. As you can see, it took a very long time, and the Pope was long dead before it was finished. And it was finally positioned in this church in Rome, not where it was initially meant to be, but just hold on, and we'll be going back and forth with different projects for the tomb while we look at other works that Michelangelo has been commissioned for. Initially, the tomb was to be an enormously grand affair. This is not a drawing by Michelangelo, but an artist's later rendering based upon descriptions of what was initially planned, freestanding, and to be placed under the dome of St. Peter's Cathedral, which was being rebuilt, and decorated with at least 40 full-size and over life-size figures. And here, this rendering perhaps gives you a little better idea of some of the details. The male figures on the lower level, flanking niches with female faiths or victories, we're not really sure because they were never created. Moses on the top to the right, and an image of the Pope at the very top, but hardly any of this was completed. About 10 years after Julius called him, well, 8 years, the project was reduced in scale. And here is a drawing that was based upon one by Michelangelo. Some of the figures are the same as what you saw, but many fewer. And this is the same drawing rendered in a way that perhaps makes it a little more understandable. I don't know. For that rendition of the tomb, he created these two figures, which eventually are given to France as a gift. They were obviously never placed on the tomb. The project for the tomb changed so much that they were superfluous. The so-called dying slave on the left, and the so-called rebellious slave, which you see 3 versions on the right. And let me begin with him, because that top image of the rebellious slave, you see, can you see this? A black mark across his upper cheek and nose, a flaw in the marble. And this is why Michelangelo never finished this work. He would not continue to carve a block of marble, a figure that was flawed. Now, the dying slave is not finished, probably because Michelangelo ran out of time, but it is much more finished altogether. The figure itself is polished. What isn't finished, and I'm sorry I don't have a rear view for you, is some roughed out stone that helps to support the figure. And it looks like what Michelangelo meant to represent was an ape. Notice that both figures wear straps, they're bound. That's why they're called slaves. However, art historians think that they weren't meant to be slaves as such, although they could, as such, mean to represent those persons that Julius conquered, overwhelmed, that kind of thing. But also, because of the teeth of the ape, they may represent the arts. which were bound, which were fettered with his death, as he was no longer alive to feed artists, to create works of art. And that makes a lot of sense within the context of the symbolism of other Renaissance pieces. This is the tomb in its entirety. We're not going there quite yet, but I want you to see what it finally looks like. Because what was completed in its entirety and down to the most delicate details is the figure of Moses. Now, Michelangelo chose to create Moses. Notice his head with two horns. This is the traditional representation of Moses because centuries ago, the Hebrew words for rays of light, as the scriptures were translated into, I suppose it would have been Latin, were mistranslated into horns. So instead of rays of light issuing from Moses's countenance, there are horns. This is a figure which embodies, here's another term for you, terribilità. That means awesomeness. It can mean also a situation or a figure which is very intense, invokes terror, or the opposite, the sublime. Writers, speaking of Michelangelo and Julius, both describe them as figures which embody terribilità. And so here, I guess you could say, and we don't know this for sure by any means, but Michelangelo is creating or has created a figure which may embody something of his patron, as well as of himself, but especially of his patron. It looks like Moses is about to rise up. He is in a seated contrapposto position and is intensely looking to one side, as you can see. An extraordinarily muscular figure. And here is a slide that I find at the same time interesting, but humorous. I didn't draw that arrow, somebody else did after taking this photograph, but it points to one of the details of musculature that Michelangelo used in the creation of this extraordinary figure. And if you remember from the last time I spoke of Michelangelo, he learned, at least he had his first lessons of anatomy from the Augustinians as he created that wonderful crucifix for them. And he brings that knowledge forward here, as well as in the David. And it's just stunning. Now, Michelangelo is in Rome at this point, of course, working on the tomb. But Julius has died, but he continues to work on the tomb, specifically probably the Moses. But in about 15, 17, 18, three wealthy gentlemen, Roman gentlemen, persuade him to create a figure of Christ. They want a risen Christ for their church of Santa Maria sopra Minerva. And you see it here, except that Michelangelo did not carve the entirety of this work. In fact, he created a figure of Christ that dates to about 1516, and it was a piece of marble that turned out to be flawed, and so he left it and he went back to Florence. And this is where he created this work with the help of his assistant, Pietro Urbano. And it was set up in a niche and moved around a bit. And now it just stands against the wall, as you can see, in the Church of Maria sopra Minerva. Michelangelo did not plan that loincloth. I could not find a photograph for you of the statue without that bronze, hideous loincloth. It's not Michelangelo's best work by any means. And as I said, I think he didn't finish it. The torso is his, the arms are his, the legs are his, the feet aren't, the face isn't, the hair isn't. Carved by Pietro Urbano to quote unquote finish the statue so that it could be in place and show itself properly. But you've got to get pretty close to this work to see how frail it is in those portions that Michelangelo didn't touch, because he couldn't. He was too busy. I guess this isn't going to show up very well, is it? The tomb was rethought again in 1516. Sorry about this slide. And it was scaled down to include now 22 figures. So it's about half the size that it originally was. And the plan of 1513 scaled it down, and now it's down to about 22 figures. So Michelangelo is in Florence at this juncture, and one of the Medici cardinals, who will soon be elected Pope, gets in touch with him, writes to him, and says, Michelangelo, what's going on with the tomb? Of course, it's a Della Rovere tomb. It's not a Medici tomb, but nevertheless, it's a papal monument. What's going on with this? And Michelangelo has been ill. He hasn't been able to work. But subsequently, the cardinal persuades him, probably orders him, to create 4 figures for the tomb. And you see 2 of them here. As you can see, neither of them is finished. And the other 2 are here, also unfinished, because he ran out of time. But these images, these figures of so-called slaves, prigioni, or prisoners, as they're often called in the literature, were to take the place of the dying and rebellious slaves, so-called. They are much larger, they're taller, they're broader, but again, they never made it onto the tomb. But Michelangelo is rethinking his imagery, you see, as the years sail by and the images become bigger, and you could say even tougher in terms of what they have to say regarding their compositions. Now, I thought this might be useful. I'm not quite sure. Just checking the time here. To give you a list of the popes for this particular period of time. So Julius, and then Leo X, as you can see, who was a Medici. He was not the one who was bothering Michelangelo about the tomb. Hadrian was a non sequitur. He was hated, and he didn't reign very long, as you can see. And it's thought that he probably was poisoned. He was so hated. And then Clement VII, another Medici, is the one I've been referring to as cardinal, and then a future pope. So these are the big guns here, for a time anyway. Now, speaking of the Medici, in about 1519, Michelangelo is commissioned to create tombs for 4 of the, you could say, most notable Medici. Clearly not those that I just introduced to you there, who were popes, but who had reigned in the 15th century, and then who had died in the early 16th century. So let me tell you what you're looking at here. It's the Church of San Lorenzo in Florence, and right next door, to the right, literally, of this church is the Medici Palace. And the reason why in 1519, 1520, the Medici tombs became an issue is because, let me give you a little data here. There was a young Giuliani who died in 1516 at the age of 38. He had borne no children. And then his brother Lorenzo died in 1519. He was the catalyst at the age of 28. And his wife had borne a daughter, Catherine, who will become the Queen of France. But basically, this was the end of the Medici dynasty. And so something had to be done about that. They had to be commemorated. And the other 2 figures that I was alluding to are also Lorenzo and Giuliano. Lorenzo the Magnificent, who died in 1492, who took Michelangelo in as his son in 1490. And then his brother Giuliano, who was murdered. And therefore their sons with their names followed them, but the dynasty came to an end. Now, this is the old sacristy, as you can read, of San Lorenzo, which was built and decorated largely, not exclusively, by Filippo Brunelleschi. There's some work by Donatello here, the Tondi in the arches. And I show you this because what Michelangelo designed for the new sacristy, or the Medici tombs, is very similar, but much grander than this. In other words, what you see here are white plaster walls, and what looks to be kind of a light gray is actually, in reality, a dark gray called Pietra Serena, serene stone, a very popular stone because it's so beautiful. And this is what Michelangelo used in his new sacristy. So this is more or less what I was just telling you. The new sacristy begun in 1519, of the tombs of the Capitani, the young Giuliano and the young Lorenzo, and then the tomb of the Magnifici, the older Giuliano and the older Lorenzo. So we're standing behind the altar here and looking across at the Medici Madonna, and we'll look at her in a little bit in some detail. And to the left is the tomb of the young Giuliano, and to the right is the tomb of the young Lorenzo. Now, Michelangelo made a number of sketches working out what he thought he would like to build and decorate in this architectural space that he also constructed, as I said. And this is one of his plans that never saw the light of day. As you can see, it's a sketch for a double tomb. Each of these tombs are singular, but here you have an idea for a double. Anyway, two of the Capitani together, or two of the Magnifici together. I want you to notice the sarcophagi at the lowest level and the curved lids. And I'm going to read you something. I hope I don't bore you to tears here. But it's been a puzzlement for art historians to understand why the lids of the sarcophagi are curved, because they aren't usually. But here's Howard Hibbard's understanding. And it's a reference to Dante. Of course, Michelangelo knew Dante, not personally, but knew his work, right? Quote, Dante describes life as being an arc that rises and then falls and has 4 segments. The 4 ages of man, the 4 seasons, the 4 times of day. And it's thought that this idea of rising and falling is why these sarcophagi have curved lids. Now, the fellow who wrote this dialogue, Donato Giannotti, was a great friend of Michelangelo's. And what he is talking about is exactly what I described to you, and about the rising and falling of time, ages of man, 4 seasons. I guess that's it. Now, the tomb of Giuliano shows an alert figure. This is not necessarily a portrait. He's clad in armor. He and his brother Lorenzo were nicknamed the Capitani. They were officially captains of the church. So they are shown in armor, antique armor. And he is looking across to the Medici Madonna with a baton over his lap in a pose that should remind you of the figure of Moses. It's a kind of contrapposto seated position. Now, below him is a female figure of night and a male figure of day. The alert figure of this Medici is accompanied by these most definitive times of day and night. The figure of night is the only figure which is accompanied by other images, iconic images. Her left leg embraces an owl, a night creature, right? And a bunch of poppies, which induce sleep, and a mask. I'll show you the mask in detail in a moment, which has been defined as, the terror of dreams at times. And then there's this that I just think is so delightful. Michelangelo had another friend, Ascanio Condivi, who wrote a life of Michelangelo in 1553. And in that life of Michelangelo, he talks about this figure of night. And as my source says here, we learn from Condivi that still another symbol was planned for one of these figures, meaning the figure of night, a mouse. Because this little animal gnaws and consumes, just as time devours all things, Michelangelo left a piece of marble on the work for it, which he did not carve. None of these figures is finished. None of the figures of the times of day is finished in any event. And if I may continue with my source here, the general significance of the night and of the times of day as a group seems to be clarified by this uncarved mouse. As another art historian has argued, it is a version of the truth stated in Petrarch's Triumphs, that death yields to the triumph of fame. And here we are, the death of the last possible Medici to produce an heir who didn't. But then fame yields to the triumph of time. Certainly man's mortal life soon succumbs to the gnawing of time, and this is the simplest explanation of the statues and of the mouse. And here's a view of that mask. Terrifying, isn't it? And a couple of other views I found that shows you how unfinished these figures are. The figure of day, by the way, is modeled after a very famous classical bust that torso, I should say, that Michelangelo revered. And here you see them again. And this is the view that you would have if you were actually in the chapel looking up. And this is Lorenzo, accompanied by Dusk, the male figure, and Dawn, the female figure. Lorenzo is looking very thoughtful, perhaps. His quiet attitude is attributed to the fact, whether it's true or not, that it's understood that he died mad. But anyway, this more contemplative figure is accompanied by these, less defined times of day, dusk or twilight and dawn. And here's a good view of those figures, I think. At the base of the sarcophagi were to be figures of rivers, having to do, of course, with territory that the Medici ruled over, but only models were made, and they never made it in a final form. So here's Giuliano looking across now to the Medici Madonna. She's flanked by the Medici saints, Cosmos and Damian, carved by hands other than Michelangelo's. She is an exquisite figure who exhibits Michelangelo's continuing interest in the relationship between mother and child. Here is a kind of Madonna lactans, which means a nursing Madonna, but not quite. The child is not nursing, but is turned in the direction of her breast. Straddling her leg. Does that remind you of anything you've seen tonight? And again, an example of the non finito, as you'll see in a moment. This is a drawing that Michelangelo created around about this same time of a Madonna lactans. It's quite large. Did he mean it as a study for a sculpture? We have no idea. And I bring back the Taddeo Tandi because, Tondo rather, because the relationship of the child here, right, to the figure of his mother is somewhat similar. Now I'm running out of time, So let me go a little more quickly, and I promise only to go 5 minutes over. This figure of a victory is a work that was created again around about the same time in the 1530s. Let me check my notes here. 1527 to 30. And it was meant for the tomb. Michelangelo had changed his mind about what kinds of figures should go in the niches on the bottom level of the tomb, and from female faiths to male victories. Now, the term that you see here, figura serpentinata, means, you can probably figure it out, but a serpentine figure. See how the figure of the victory twists around, supported on the back of this man who may be a portrait of Michelangelo, we're not quite sure, over whom he has been victorious. But this kind of twisting figure becomes one of the hallmarks of the next stage of the Renaissance, called mannerism, and Michelangelo invented it. Here's that slide that we can't see anything of particularly, and I showed you, I wanted you to see that image again, because it's that iteration of the tomb that this figure was to grace. This beautiful little figure of Apollo is somewhat like the victory, but not so exotic in terms of its contrapposto. Again, unfinished, and it was created for this fellow Baccio Valori, who was an agent of the Medici. Whether he commissioned it from Michelangelo or not, or Michelangelo made it for him to make things a little bit better between him and the Medici, because they were not getting along at all, because Michelangelo was not doing what he wanted them to do. We don't know. This Brutus is the only such bust that Michelangelo created, and it comes out of a terrible bit of Medici history. A younger Medici by the name of Alessandro became duke in the early years of the 16th century, and he was terrible. He killed people. He just was, he was a monster. And so one of his relatives killed him, and his relative was considered a modern day Brutus. So out of this situation comes this non-commissioned work by Michelangelo. And I show you a bust of Caligula, a Roman bust, to show you that Michelangelo was very well aware of that form, which he copied. And this is the finale of the Julius tomb. And the two figures which were created at the finish of this work are Rachel, who's a contemplative figure, and her sister Leah, representing an active life, so a contemplative life and an active life. The Rachel is exquisitely beautiful and soulful, and Leah is quietly active. And they complement that great Moses. Almost there. Michelangelo started carving this work, as you can see, in about 1546, 47, as an image to be placed at his gravesite. It is a work which includes, as you can see, of course, a figure which is a self-portrait of Michelangelo, Mary, Christ, who's very dead, and then the Magdalene. 4 figures carved out of a single block of marble. This had never been done. And Michelangelo got as far as he possibly could with this work, and then consciously gave it up because it sounds as though he was becoming pretty superstitious. If he'd finished this work, which was created for his own grave, then that would mean his death. And here's a detail showing the figure of Christ embedded, the head of Christ anyway, embedded in the face of his mother. And that brings us to his very last work, the Rondinini Pietà. There is an arm to the left, which belonged to another group or pair, we're not sure which, that Michelangelo began years before. But here, as the biographer of Vasari says, and I'm going to be paraphrasing here, Michelangelo needed to carve marble to continue carving until he could not lift a chisel and carve any longer. And he worked on this pair until 6 days before he died. Some denigrate this Madonna and Child because the figures are so elongated. And the Non Finito clearly has the upper hand. But look at the figure of Mary as she absorbs her son. And this is exactly what Michelangelo wanted to produce. Thank you.
Thank you, Ellen. That was so wonderful. Does anybody have any questions or comments? You can put them in chat, or you can unmute yourselves if you want to ask a question. We can do that for a couple minutes if you'd like. Nancy, go ahead.
Thank you. What a great, thanks, Ellen. That was fantastic.
Oh, well, you're very kind, Nan.
Oh, love it. So the tomb of the Pope, when you first said that he wanted it to be, that's kind of like a big monument to himself at St. Peter's.
Yeah.
Where is the tomb? Where's the?
Oh, where is it?
Mm.
It's in another church in Rome, San Pietro in Vincoli.
Okay. Because I don't remember seeing it when I was at St. Peter's. And I thought that was like, when his first ideas, that's kind of like it's like the Trump of this time. No, it's like, that was like, wow. I was thinking of the pyramids, making this humongous statue to yourself. I didn't even know that they did that.
Well, that was Julius II. Had it been possible, it would have been done.
Wow.
Yeah.
I didn't even know that popes even considered doing that. So thanks for all that information. That was really awesome.
Well, there's no other papal tomb like this anywhere.
Okay.
Just a couple messages from chat. Peter says, wonderful, thank you. And Ann Fisher said, wonderful. So.
Well, thank you very much. Appreciate it. It's wonderful having you all here.
I had a quick question, if y'all can hear me.
Yeah, go ahead, Steve.
Yes. So when I see these sculptures in these elaborate frames, columns, the architecture, all looks like it's carved out of the same kind of marble. He wouldn't have carved that, right? He carved the centerpiece, and then these were left to others to carve, like, the fluting behind or above or beside.
You're talking about this, for instance, Steve?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
sort of a group effort, or, some
Oh.
certain artisans were given, some of the architectural pieces, and the really good people could then put the figure
Yeah.
in place.
Well, and more often than not, Michelangelo would go to the Carrara marble, call them pits, marble quarries, that's it. And um and select what he wanted for whatever commission it was that he would be working on. So Carrara marble was favored by Michelangelo. It's just one of the best marbles in the world. But I can't imagine that the entirety of this tomb is Carrara marble. I don't know. But his figures primarily would have been, as far as I know, Steve. Does that
Interesting.
answer your question?
Yeah, I just, you showed some drawings that he had produced. Did he plan how the whole thing looked, and then had other people do some of the
Oh, sure.
architectural components?
Oh,
Or
sure.
did somebody else plan it, like, another artisan?
Oh, he'd have to. He couldn't do all that. He couldn't do what was asked of him in the first place.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah.
Thank you. Cool.
Well, thank you. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you.
It's my nephew.
My aunt. Your other nephew might be on mute somewhere in cyberspace here
Oh, you
watching.
think?
Yeah, I got a late start, Auntie. Sorry.
Oh, hi.
Hey,
Yeah.
Ellen, I thought your comment also about being able to see so many unfinished works is truly amazing, to be able to see the process.
Mm.
And your images really helped. That image of the woman's face with chisel marks, that was really, I mean, I don't do sculpture, so it was really interesting to see how the work was brought forward. And then even the last bits when they weren't finished, it really does look really interesting just as a piece in itself. I know it's supposed to be finished, but I kind of like it when it's not too.
Yeah.
Thanks for
Well,
sharing that.
Well, sure. And what I should have done, I thought about it, but many of his drawings, Nan, incorporate those same marks. And of course they do. The same striated marks of the pen, as opposed to the chisel, yeah. So digs away at the paper as he digs away at the stone. Yeah.
Thank you so much again. Thank
Oh,
you.
well, thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Marty.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I was all those unfinished works. There's lots of unfinished poems in my journal, but I can't imagine getting that far on a piece of marble, carving it to that point. I mean, even his unfinished work is so beautiful.
Yes.
And then just sort of abandoning it. It's like, oh, look, the marble's it's blemished. I can't finish it. And I'm like, what are you talking about? That's just fascinating to me, that you would
Yeah.
abandon something that you'd worked on and gotten to at that point.
That's very particular.
Wow.
Yeah.
It's amazing. Well, I want to thank everybody for coming, taking time out. I know this is a very busy time of year for everybody, so I really appreciate you all showing up tonight.
And I do too. Thank you.
Yeah. And oh, Melinda says bravo, Elle. Thank you. And I wish you all, if I don't see you, I wish you all a really wonderful holiday season, however you celebrate. Ellen, I look forward to getting together with you and John when you're back in town and lifting some libations with you. Just for those who are
Don't give us away, Marty.
I won't. I didn't say where we were going to lift libations. We're just lifting libations.
Oh, okay.
I will
Here.
tell you. I will tell you that the next artisan, their art, we we haven't talked about what the subject is going to be, but the next artist in their art would be in March 18th is the third Tuesday of that month. So we'll be doing it on March 18th. That will be the
Okay.
next one. So,
Thank you.
all right.
Good to know.
Bye.
Okay, everybody. Have a great night. Have a wonderful holiday season. And
Yeah.
we'll see you all later.
Safe travels.
All
Ciao,
right.
ciao.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Good night, Annie.